The Terrible Two by Mac Barnett and Jory John. Illustrated by Kevin Cornell. Read by Miss Clabaugh. Chapter 32. Niles rubbed his hands together. He blew into his fists. It was the first time Miles had ever seen Niles nervous. Niles raised his hands to his mouth, and his voice was startling in the blackness. Hey, boss! Hey, boss! Hup, hup! Nothing happened. That wasn't good. It's fine, Niles said. Different farmers use different calls. Okay, Miles said. Niles cried out again. Suey, boss, suey! Silence. A sheepish shrug from Niles. Miles chewed on his thumb. This part had not been his responsibility, but maybe it should have been. I've got more. Niles cleared his throat. Come on, boss! Come on! Somewhere nearby, a cow mooed, and so did another cow, and another. The night was full of moos. The moos were nearby, and they were getting closer. Come on, boss, Niles said. Moo, said the cows. Ha ha, said Miles, except that he didn't say it. He was actually laughing. A big cow-shaped shadow came over the hill, mooing and ringing. Hey, bossy, said Niles. She's got the bell around her neck. That's the lead cow. Now the cows came from all over, up from the gully, out from the trees. The meadow filled with one of Bob Barkin's dairy herds, perhaps wondering why this morning's milking was starting so early, but probably not. After all, they were cows. Bossy was getting close now, and some of the cows were beginning to fall in behind her. Niles clapped his hands. Okay, let's go. Niles hopped on the bike. Come on, boss, he shouted. He reached back and threw a handful of hay in the direction of the approaching herd. Bossy scooped it up without stopping and kept moving towards Niles. Standing up on the pedals, Niles Sparks started to ride. Bossy followed the hay, and the cows followed Bossy. And Miles had a job to do. Chapter 33. In almost 2 months of reading about moving cows, Miles Murphy's favorite bit was a passage from J.M. Iverson's Herding with Dignity. Every creature on earth is either predator or prey. A cow is a prey animal. Cows think like prey. They react like prey. If you want to move cows, you've got to move like a predator. Miles eyed the herd. They were ambling around in a clump. Calves and cows both, sort of following Niles's bike as he pedaled. But some were moving in the wrong direction, and some just stood there, and more than a few were munching on grass. Miles ducked into a low crouch. You're a coyote, Miles thought. He sprang forward. Tense and graceful, Miles moved across the grass. As he approached the rear of the herd, the stragglers raised their heads. Their ears perked up. They mooed. They turned towards Miles and stared him down. And then they started moving. Miles moved towards the cows. They moved away. And now the whole clump was going, following Niles on the bike down a knoll, with Miles bringing up the rear. Miles was zigzagging back and forth to the outer edges of the herd, side to side, like a coyote, the cows getting jumpy. They bucked, they snorted, they tossed their tails. Miles felt their resistance and kept sweeping from side to side, pressing the animals forward. You're a coyote, you're a coyote. As they crested a low rise, a single cow spooked and trotted off from the herd. Miles wanted to chase, but he swallowed his instinct and let her go. 10 seconds later she stopped, swiveled her head nervously, and rejoined the procession. It was just like Iverson had said in Chapter 1, Paragraph 1. Cows like to stay together. After a quarter mile, the herd had thinned out into a line, walking 2 or 3 across. They were really mooing now. The adults were in the front, the calves, jumpy and gawky, behind. Bringing up the rear were what must have been the oldest cows, grumpy and reluctant. Then there was Miles, zigging and zagging, a coyote. Miles did a rough count. They were riding herd on more than 100 head of cattle. He was pretty sure he was using all those terms the right way. Forward, forward into the night. He could feel the momentum. "Gate!" Niles called out from his bike. "Gate!" Miles dropped back and let the line get ahead. Then he peeled off far to the left and sprinted past the calves, past the cows, past Niles and the hay. He ran through white puffs of his own breath, throwing himself against the metal fence. The latch was cold against his bare hands, and Miles used his whole body to swing the gate open. There was the bang of the gate and the clang of Bossy's cowbell and the squeaking of Niles's bike. Miles ran alongside the fence for a while, picked a spot to climb over, and dropped down to the ground. Then he was up again and running as fast as he could. Niles was getting close to the gate, the herd right behind him. Miles had to make it back to the rear of the line. He took his position in time to see Niles coast through the gate, tossing some hay over his shoulder. "Come on, boss, come on." Bossy was through, then the next 2 cows, and then more. Miles pressed forward, willing the cows to move, to walk on. Get through the gate, get through the gate. He was relentless, alert to the motion of the herd and the movements of the individual cows. Miles breathed in the heat from their bodies. Their smell was rich and sweet, and it was in his nose and in his throat. Soon all the cows were through the gate, and so was Miles. He stopped to take a breath. Up ahead, his friend was riding a bike in the light of a rising moon, and Miles was here, breathing, and there was a line of 100 cows between them. It was after midnight, and nobody, not Miles, not Niles, not the cows, was where they were supposed to be. And that felt right. Miles dropped into a crouch and sank his fingers into the damp earth. In the soil, beetles shuddered, worms tunneled, and grass strived upward. Miles could feel it all in his fingertips. Niles rode on, and the cows followed, away from the gate, away from the fence, away from Bob Barkin's farm. Niles pumped a fist into the air, and Miles howled at the sky. Chapter 34. A line of cows 500 feet long proceeded 2 by 2 down Chapman Drive, one of the quietest streets in the sleepy town of Yawny Valley. Niles and Miles had plotted their route carefully. It was 3:13 a.m., and nobody was out. Miles rang the bell on his bike twice. Intersection. Then Miles was sprinting again, up on the lawns, hopping hedges, maybe trampling a couple of early blooming flower beds. He arrived at the corner of Chapman and Trellis well before Niles, who was weaving slowly to give Miles plenty of time to unshoulder his backpack and take out Niles's quick-pitch tent. He tossed it into the air with a flick of the wrist, and the tent sprang as it unfolded at the peak of its arc. It landed and bounced. Miles positioned the tent on one side of the intersection, blocking off Trellis Drive in one direction. At least, that was the idea. The tent looked puny now in the middle of the road, and Miles hoped it was enough to discourage the cows from bolting off down the wrong street. It would have to be. Miles took his position on the other side of Trellis. Niles cruised by wearing a madman's grin. And then the cows. They gave him placid looks, wild looks, accusing looks. The cows were close enough for Miles to touch, so he did. The cow flinched when Miles reached out and brushed his hand against her flank. Her hair was coarse and damp and warm. Miles put his hand to his nose. He smelled like an animal. It was the first time Miles had touched a cow. The old cows dragged past, and the intersection was clear. It was time to fold up the tent. This was supposed to be simple, but Niles had never gotten the hang of it. The idea was that the same collapsible silver sunshade Miles's mom had in her car, but Miles had never been able to figure that out either. After wrestling with the tent for about a minute, Miles had gotten it into a poky, misshapen lump small enough to fit back in the backpack. Miles took off down the road and caught up with the herd just in time to hear Niles ring his bell twice again. There were 6 more intersections on their path that night, and by the 4th, Miles was running down the street, hugging the pitch tent in front of himself. He fumbled, he tripped, but they made it without losing a single cow. And by 3:56, they were making their way down Sunny Slope Road, the home stretch. 5 urgent rings from Niles's bell. They had company. At the head of the line, Niles was waving to a figure standing in the middle of a house's front lawn. As Miles got closer, he saw it was a man, an old man, wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. The man stood agog, watching the parade of cows by his house. "If anyone sees us, and they probably won't," Niles had said back in the prank lab, "just play it by ear. You're good in the moment." Miles tried to take a nervous gulp, but his throat was too tight. By the time he'd made it to the man's mailbox, he still hadn't figured out what to say. It turned out that the man wasn't wearing just boxers. He also had a terry cloth sweatband around his head. His white hair was uncombed and shone in the moonlight. They were so close. If this fell apart now. "What are you doing in the middle of town with all these cows?" asked the man. "What are you doing out in your underwear at 4 in the morning?" Miles replied. "Fair enough," said the man, and that was that. 8 minutes later, Niles led the cows up the driveway to Yawny Valley Science and Letters Academy. He leapt off his bike and dragged the wagon up the front steps, spilling hay as he went. The keyring Niles pulled out was so big that Miles could see it from the back of the herd. Niles fiddled with the lock and slipped inside. In less than 5 seconds, the front hall glowed yellow. Niles threw the doors open. Niles pitched some more hay onto the threshold. "Come on, boss," he said, and then he disappeared inside, dragging the wagon behind him. Bossy sniffed the steps. She snorted and grumbled. Then she took the steps in 2 clumsy hops. Her head was inside, then her withers, then her rump and her tail, and then the next cow. Miles pushed forward against the herd's misgivings, exceeding steady pressure from behind. The cows disliked Miles more than they disliked stairs. They also loved moving together. It only took 6 minutes to get 107 cows through the front door of Yawny Valley Science and Letter Academy. When the last rump was through, Miles shut the door, and he waited outside. Niles flipped off the lights, slammed the front door shut. "Happy April Fool's Day," he said. Miles and Niles collapsed on their back on the school's wet grass. Miles held 2 fingers right up to the sky. "High five." Niles held up his 2. "High five." Then they laughed, and they laughed.